Hello guys, it's Thomas here doing another discussion, this time on ratchets. I know this topic might seem really strange at first, but trust me, I actually do have some things to say about ratchets. I always thought they were a really weird part in how they were made, but of course I wanted to give some time to see how they developed, and now that we're well over 2 years into Beyblade X, I feel like it's probably fair to make some judgments here. And to start off, I feel like every single Beyblade generation has sort of a core system. Obviously we get new systems throughout a generation, that's just how it goes, but all of those systems can kind of be traced back to that base original system of the generation. That's what everything is sort of built on and made around. And the parts reflect that. And of course ratchets are a part in that sense. I consider them a base part of Beyblade X. I think that's pretty obvious. And to me, they are the worst part of any base system. I feel like these were very poorly designed. Before I really get into that though, I wanted to show each ratchet to talk a little bit about them, what they do, and we could save a lot of time because ratchets are made up of two parts usually. You have sort of the outside, or the contact points, and then also the inside, which determines height. So first up here, we of course have 3 sides, and I will start with contact points, but yeah, 3 sides, just sort of these 3 points. That's all there is to it. Of course, the outside is for the burst lock. If you could twist it, comes off the blade, the bay bursts. That's how that goes, that's what it's for. So the entire outside of the ratchet is kind of null. You can't really do a whole lot with that because, yeah, it is specifically meant to be a burst point. You can't do anything crazy here because, again, it has to rotate in that way for that mechanic. So already you're kind of limiting the design. That's fine though, and I'll talk about why it's fine later, but it is still limiting. 4-sided ratchets are pretty similar. You just have 4 spots. They're smaller, they're thinner. It's very similar to 3-sided ratchets. Just modeled a little bit differently to work better with 4 sides. 5 sides does change things up a little bit. These sides are a lot flatter, they're wider, just generally bulkier, but again, you have 5 of them now, so I guess that's pretty cool. 6 sides are kind of in between. I feel like these are sticking out a little bit more, a little bit different, but generally feel close to 5 sides, maybe a little bit closer to 3 and 4 than 5 in some ways, but still pretty similar idea all things considered. 2 sides, we have these 2 larger contact points, which of course isn't very good, but they are quite large and bulky because there's only 2, so it is what it is. Now you have 9 sides. This is when we start getting into some of the weirder stuff. So with 9 sides, obviously it gets a little bit challenging to actually have, 9 proper contact points. I imagine, assuming we get 8 at some point, they'll probably have the same issue. Instead, we have kind of these 3 main points with like these couple smaller spikes around that. So it's just very small, which works well enough. At least looks different than some of the other parts so far. Now for 0 sides, of course, you expect this to be perfectly round, and to some degree it is. However, it does have these 3 points that do kind of stick downwards, which can scrape, which also can get stuck on things, but it is still round technically on the outside, so 0 sides, it works. As for 7 sides, it's just very defensive looking. I guess you have like a 1 that sticks out a bit more than the others, but generally, yeah, 7 sides just very bulky, very wall-like, bit more unique than the others, I would say, but again, it works well enough. And then for 1 side, it just kind of comes like this oval point here, and just ends up being like a larger point, which makes sense, has its uses. Definitely is probably the most striking looking ratchet, with just having its 1 large point, but yeah. Now moving on from that, we of course have heights. Now of course we initially started with 60 and 80 heights, 60 heights just kind of being at 6mm, 80 being 8mm, a 2mm difference, makes sense. But we eventually get 70 heights being 7mm, kind of bridging the gap between them, also makes sense. But we now, on these regular ratchets, also have the 50 height. 5mm, the shortest ratchet ever. So heights are a part of the ratchets, and this to me is the biggest problem with ratchets. Again, I'll get to this in a minute, but I feel like heights are a very awkward thing to manage. But before then, we do have a few other ratchets here, because in the past year or so we've gotten simple ratchets, and simple ratchets are just 1 solid piece. The outside does not turn independently of the inside, they all just work as 1 single piece. Of course, we have 385, which has a more modified shape. These parts are not as big, which is interesting, but yeah. And of course, 85 being 8.5mm, currently the tallest ratchet in Beyblade X. Then we also have 455, again, a bit modified, actually quite a bit different because these parts are flat, however, there are these kind of grooves here, and again, it's a bit different. 55 height, 5.5mm, at the time was the shortest ratchet, but not anymore. Speaking of 55, we are going to get 755 later this month, but 755 is not out yet, so, well, I can't show it. Recently, though, we've also gotten 965. 965, I'd say the 9 part is probably the closest to, you know, its original Ratchet, but it has its own height of 65, 6.5 millimeters, so it is still different. And then we, of course, have M85. M85 is the weirdest Ratchet of these. It's clearly a 5-sided ratchet, looks very, very similar to that, in a similar vein to 965, and it's also an 85 height, but the M part is the part that stands out, of course, has a large metal ring on the ratchet, adding some weight, which is definitely a way that you can add gimmicks to make ratchets more interesting. We'll get to that later, but it is something that you can clearly do, which is cool. So as for ratchet integrated bits, we of course have Turbo. Turbo, it's just kind of a 4-sided ratchet, kind of. I mean, it's obviously much, much different, but that's what it boils down to. It's mostly just a bulky bit that happens to have the ratchet attached. That's all there is to it. So on the ratchet side of things, it doesn't really do a whole lot. Operate is a little bit cooler because this actually does have a mode change. In its defensive mode, you can see that there's these wings here, and then also here. So it's technically 4-sided, but when you go into attack, you can shift that to have these pair, and now it's more like 2-sided, so I guess that's kind of cool. And also, both of these do shift heights when they change modes, but I feel like that's more just a byproduct of the mode change, not really an intentional height change, but still worth noting. So with all of that said though, what is really the problem with these ratchets? And well, it's really that they're just very, very limiting, but also not well designed structurally. So something they could have done is they could have just given these ratchets like their own unique names. Think of like discs in Burst, where a lot of them are kind of similar, but they're all considered their own unique parts. We could have multiple 3-sided ratchets, which technically we do with, you know, the regular 3-sided ratchets and something like 385, but still we could have far more of them with far different contact points. You definitely could have gotten crazier or potentially added more gimmicks had the burst mechanic been different. You could put that somewhere else or just have bit bursts, but I get why they did it like this, so not having that is fair, would have been cool, but still fair. I think ratchets could have been similar to what we see with assist blades, but again, you can just divide up blades like we've seen with CX, and well, assist blades exist, so we still have those gimmicks there, so we don't really need ratchets for that, I guess. But there are things like M85 that do show that, yeah, you can actually have some gimmicks. Maybe we get other ratchets that add metal on to existing ratchets. Maybe we get an M370 at some point, which has metal on sort of these 3 points. Something like that. Or maybe a rubber ratchet at some point. It could be sort of a simple ratchet with some rubber on the inside here, which could actually help make up for its lack of burst resistance, but it would still be lighter than normal and maybe have some other, you know, negatives to it, but still, the rubber does add quite a bit of burst resistance. I think there's things you could do there. I think that there are still things you could do with, you know, metal, rubber, although rubber has to be on the inside, not the outside, but still. There are some internal things they could do, and also, it'd be great if they maybe just stopped sticking to the static contact point amounts. Try some new stuff, make alternate versions. I think there's still things you could do with ratchets. It'd be great if they just didn't stick to one static thing. Again, with simple ratchets, they've kind of deviated from us a little bit, but I don't think it's quite enough yet, but still. So we still have avenues for ratchets to evolve, but will they do that? I don't know. I don't think they will too much, but hopefully I'm wrong on that. Hopefully we get some cool stuff. Regardless, there is still one massive, massive issue with ratchets, and that is, well, this part right here, the height part. Ratchet heights are, in my opinion, the absolute worst thing about Beyblade X. If this was different, I think Beyblade X would be a much, much better generation. It really feels like they tried to bring as much as they possibly could from the past 3 gens into Beyblade X. And part of that, I guess, is height differences from Metal Fight. You can maybe debate that, but still I feel like that's probably where they grabbed it from, and yeah, that wasn't a good plan. The problem with height differences is that it raises the contact points, obviously, if you have something like 85 versus something else like a, a 50 height. The contact points are going to be much higher on 85 versus 50. And because of that, a lower bay can easily just burst a taller bay. And because of how they make ratchets, we are probably going to keep getting taller ratchets that we really just don't need. At the very least, as much as I've complained about CX's height differences, with those, it is a center of gravity issue. It's not necessarily a massive bursting issue, but with ratchets it is, because again, you raise the sort of burst lock higher, which means that bays that are shorter now just have that inherent advantage. Now you can argue that if a bay is too short, that could have its own issues, and I guess you could see that with something like stock shark scale, or maybe it's too short, it's scrape or whatever. But the problem is that they haven't designed Beyblade X around shark scale. That is a very short bay. A standard 60 height bay will generally just be better than an 80 height bay. I'm not saying that you can't get these taller combos to work, but they're generally much more niche and people don't really want to use them. I mean, there's a reason why 60 heights consistently just dominate, because even on taller CX bays, the ratchets are still going to be just as low or high, so you want them to be lower. Which is why 50 and 60 height stuff is generally going to be what people go to. 70 height maybe for more niche stuff, and 80 is just super niche, and there's plenty of 80 height ratchets that will just never be used because the contact points aren't strong enough. Like, you can get by with something like 460 because it's low enough. It's not ideal, but again, you could use it, whereas 480 you would never want to use. Which is also why I wish that ratchets were more unique to one another. It wasn't just two numbers put together and that's your ratchet, because then you could have more styles of contact points, different stuff going on. It's not just, okay, well now 4 sides are all just bad because we made the 4 contact point part of ratchets bad. You know, it's not ideal. To me personally, I really wish ratchets just could have had their own unique names, all just have their own unique contact points, and height differences just didn't exist. Maybe they could exist in some capacity, but it'd be like a more unique thing that you don't see much, and heights were generally more static, which I know to some would just sound like less customization, less dynamic bays, but I feel like it's probably worthwhile because then we don't have a bunch of ratchets that are just worthless, and also height becomes a much smaller issue if heights are just more consistent. I feel like that'd be better because, again, we aren't just getting thrown a bunch of parts like, I don't know, 280 here, for example, that no one wants to use. Or I guess a better example probably like 780, because at least with 780, 7 sides actually does have, you know, some solid uses. At the 60 height, maybe 70 height, but at 80 heights, not saying you can't use 780, but generally it's going to see much, much less use opposed to things like 760, because again, it's just too tall. People don't want tall bays. At least not in this generation, because again, height stuff can work. Like in Metal Fight, I think it was okay, but in Burst, when you specifically raise the burst lock, that really just causes a lot of problems in my opinion. So I guess you could have incorporated height stuff as well if the burst lock wasn't there, but I feel like it makes a lot more sense for the burst lock to be there than not, so I feel like the height is probably the thing I would opt to get rid of. I feel like they were just trying to do a little bit too much with these parts, maybe put a little bit too much into them to where they can't expand or vary enough opposed to what they maybe should have been. And yeah, I feel like if heights weren't really a thing, then parts could be more consistent and parts would be judged more on the contact points or whatever else they have than just having a lot of them be thrown out because, well, they're too tall. So, I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I feel like it's something that's at least kind of agreeable, because I know I don't really do any battling stuff, but I feel like this is still worth talking about just because it does heavily limit bays a lot, and I feel like that's something that, even for me, I take note of. So yeah, I wish they could have just handled this better, but at this point, I don't see that changing. But anyways, I think that's all for this video. Sorry if this is sort of an odd one. I just really want to talk about ratchets because I've been thinking about it for a while, but I didn't want to make another sort of problem video because last minute that went interestingly to say the least, but I figured we could just talk about ratchets as a whole and then throughout to talk about some of the problems, and hopefully it was at least kind of interesting. But yeah, we'll see if ratchets change over time. Would be glad to talk about different ratchets if they make more unique stuff, but for now, I'm not too sure of that. So anyways, hopefully we don't get 90 hit ratchets. That'd be really, really unfortunate, but with that said, thanks for watching, and bye-bye.